The guards at the forward aid station on Okinawa watched the Japanese prisoner collapse onto the stretcher, his uniform stained black with blood and coral dust, and one of them spat into the dirt. "Waste of plasma on that animal," he muttered. April 1945. Somewhere in the nightmare maze of caves and ridges, where men died for yards. The prisoner's eyes flickered open just long enough to see the American nurse approaching, and in that moment his face twisted with something beyond pain, certainty. Certainty that the blade would come next, that the ritual he'd been taught to expect from captors would now be his. The propaganda had been clear. American devils tortured prisoners, desecrated bodies, wore skulls as trophies. He closed his eyes and waited for the end. These demons, the radio broadcasts had promised, show no mercy to the sons of Nippon. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in the metal-walled field hospitals and canvas-roofed aid stations scattered across the Pacific Theater, a different war was being fought. One that didn't fit into the newsreels or the propaganda. One measured not in body counts, but in bandages changed, plasma bottles hung, morphine syrettes administered with the same care, whether the arm wore khaki or the tattered remnants of Imperial Brown. The United States Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps had deployed over 60,000 women across every combat theater by 1945, trained to a standard that would have astonished their enemies. 400 hours of classroom instruction, 6 months of clinical rotations, certifications in trauma surgery assistance, infectious disease control, and battlefield triage protocols that prioritized medical need over nationality. These weren't the comfort women or auxiliary volunteers of the Japanese medical system. These were commissioned officers carrying the rank of second lieutenant or ensign, with the authority to override enlisted men and the training to perform emergency procedures that would save thousands of lives on both sides of the wire. The specifications read like a mobilization miracle. Each field hospital unit deployed with a standard complement of surgical equipment that included 16 instrument sets capable of handling everything from compound fractures to abdominal wounds, portable X-ray machines weighing 400 pounds that could be assembled in under 30 minutes, and enough plasma and whole blood to treat 200 casualties before resupply. The nurses themselves carried aid bags weighing 22 pounds containing tourniquets, sulfanilamide powder, morphine syrettes marked with dosage lines at quarter-grain intervals, compress bandages measuring 4 inches by 7 with ties long enough to secure limbs or torsos, and scissors sharp enough to cut through leather boots or uniform webbing in seconds. But the real equipment, the piece of gear that changed everything, was invisible, impossible to quantify in quartermaster reports. The training that taught them to see wounds instead of faces, to hear breathing rates instead of accents, to feel for pulses instead of hatred. It hadn't started that way. The early Pacific campaigns had been brutal education, lessons written in blood and cultural collision. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, the first Japanese prisoners arrived at American aid stations expecting execution and receiving instead transfusions, expecting torture and receiving morphine. The nurses didn't understand the shock in those eyes, didn't realize they were overturning an entire cosmology with every foreline inserted. Some prisoners refused treatment, turned their faces to the wall, waited for death with the stoic resignation their training demanded. Others fought, lashed out in delirium or desperation, and had to be restrained not with violence, but with leather straps and firm hands and voices that repeated the same phrases. "You're safe now. We're going to help you. Hold still." The American medical doctrine was unambiguous, drilled into every corpsman and nurse from their first day of training. Treat all wounded according to medical priority, enemy and friendly alike, and do it fast enough that the next man in line doesn't die waiting. The turning point came not from policy but from repetition, from the accumulation of small mercies that built into something larger. A nurse named Lieutenant Patricia Morrison, working a field hospital on New Georgia in October 1943, recorded in her diary the moment she realized the propaganda was crumbling. Today, a Japanese soldier with a shattered leg asked me, through the interpreter, if I was really going to operate on him. When I said yes, he started crying. Not from pain, we'd already given him morphine, but from disbelief. He said he'd been told we would eat him, Morrison and her team performed the surgery, saved the leg, and watched as the prisoner spent his recovery teaching the hospital staff basic Japanese phrases while they taught him English. 6 weeks later, when he was transferred to the POW camp on Guadalcanal, he bowed to every nurse on the ward and said in halting English, "I tell others, American nurses, kind hands, strong medicine." That phrase, kind hands, strong medicine, spread through the prison camps faster than any leaflet drop or radio broadcast. It traveled in whispered conversations between exhausted men who'd survived battles they'd been told were glorious deaths, who'd been captured in moments of confusion or injury or simple human exhaustion when the propaganda couldn't sustain them anymore. The American system, they learned, was different. Prisoners at camps on Hawaii, on the West Coast, in the mountain facilities of Colorado and Utah, received medical care that exceeded what many had experienced in the Imperial Army. Regular dental checkups, treatment for chronic conditions like malaria and tuberculosis, surgeries for old wounds that had healed badly. The nurses moved through the ward like professionals because that's exactly what they were. Specialists in trauma care who'd seen every variation of blast injury, every complication from tropical disease, every infection that could take a man from walking wounded to critical in hours. The vignette that became legend happened on Saipan, July 1944, in the chaotic aftermath of the civilian mass suicides at Marpi Point. A Japanese medic named Takashi Endo had surrendered with a group of wounded soldiers, carrying in his arms a child, maybe 4 years old, maybe 5, burned so badly that her face was unrecognizable, her breathing shallow and rapid with shock. The Marines who'd taken them prisoner loaded them all onto a truck bound for the field hospital, and Endo sat clutching the child and waiting for the moment when the Americans would take her away, would separate them, would let her die because she was just another enemy, just another number in the vast arithmetic of total war. Instead, when they arrived at the hospital tent, a Navy nurse named Lieutenant Commander Helen Fisher took one look at the child, shouted for plasma and burn kits, and began working with a speed and precision that left Endo stunned. She cut away the charred clothing, applied sulfadazine cream to the burns with hands that never hesitated, started in 4-line in the child's tiny arm on the first attempt, and kept up a running commentary to her team that managed to be both clinical and somehow gentle. Second and third-degree burns across 40% of body surface, likely smoke inhalation, possible infection starting in the shoulder wound. Let's get her stable and prep for debridement. The child survived. Endo, watching from his own cot as the nurses worked through the night, later told interrogators, "I saw the American devil women the radio spoke of, but they had angel hands." The offensive shock came not in a single battle, but in the grinding arithmetic of the island campaigns, where the Japanese defenders learned that American medical care extended even into the meat grinder assaults. On Peleliu in September 1944, where Marines fought through coral ridges that shredded men into hamburger, the field hospitals processed over 4,000 wounded in the first week. Americans, yes, but also Japanese prisoners who'd been pulled from caves and pillboxes with wounds that would have meant death anywhere else in the Pacific. A captured lieutenant named Yoshiro Tanaka, both legs shattered by a grenade blast, watched through morphine haze as a surgical team worked on him with the same urgency they'd shown the Marine on the next table. When he woke after the operation, both legs in casts, he asked the interpreter a question that revealed the depth of the cultural divide. "Why am I still alive?" The nurse checking his vitals, Lieutenant Mary Chun, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke enough Japanese to understand him, answered without looking up from her clipboard. "Because that's our job. We fix people. We don't sort them by flag." Tanaka would later tell fellow prisoners at the Guam POW camp, "The Americans fight like demons but heal like... I have no word. There's no word in our language for what they do." The upgrades came not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in the steady refinement of systems, the kind of incremental improvement that American industry and medical training excelled at producing. By 1945, the standard field hospital deployment included portable penicillin production units that could synthesize enough antibiotic to treat 100 infections per week, cutting mortality from infected wounds by 60%. The nurses learned to spot the early signs of gas gangrene, the peculiar sweet smell, the crackling sensation under the skin, and could have a man in surgery within minutes, the surgeons cutting away dead tissue while the nurses managed the anesthesia and monitored vitals with a precision that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. They learned to recognize the patterns of Japanese wounds, the distinctive tears from Type 99 rifle rounds, the shrapnel patterns from Type 97 grenades, the crush injuries from cave collapses during flamethrower attacks. And they learned the psychological patterns too. The shame spirals that could kill a man as surely as infection, the cultural barriers that made some prisoners refuse food or water because accepting charity from women was unbearable dishonor. The sound of the field hospital became its own character in the Pacific Theater. The hiss of steam sterilizers running constantly in the tropical heat, the metallic click of surgical instruments being sorted into trays, the soft repetitive beeping of makeshift cardiac monitors rigged from radio parts and telephone relays, and underneath it all the voices, American nurses speaking in calm professional tones that transcended language barriers, explaining procedures through interpreters or simply through touch and gesture when no translation was available. Morphine, they'd say, holding up the syringe where the prisoner could see it. Medicine, help pain. Then the practiced motion, swab, inject, disposal in the sharps container, notation on the chart. Every prisoner who survived the initial shock of capture, who lived through the first terrifying hours of waiting for death that never came, eventually heard that voice, felt those hands, and began to understand that something in their understanding of the enemy had been catastrophically wrong. The range of American medical care extended far beyond the forward aid stations. The entire logistics system was designed around a principle the Japanese military had never seriously attempted: comprehensive evacuation and treatment networks that moved wounded from battlefield to hospital ship to stateside recovery facility with the same efficiency that moved ammunition forward. Hospital ships like the USS Comfort and USS Hope cruised the Pacific with full surgical suites, X-ray facilities, and nursing staffs of over 100, capable of handling 400 patients simultaneously. Prisoners recovered alongside American wounded, ate the same food, received the same physical therapy, watched the same movies in the recovery wards. The cultural shock was profound. A Japanese soldier named Kenji Yamamoto, recovering from surgery on the USS Solace after the Iwo Jima campaign, wrote in a diary later seized by camp authorities, "Today I watched American movie with other prisoners, cowboys and Indians. The Americans cheered for cowboys. I thought about propaganda that called them devils. Devils do not laugh at silly movie. Devils do not bring extra blanket when you are cold at night. I have been lied to about everything." The enemy respect emerged slowly, grudgingly, encoded in documents that weren't meant for American eyes, but were captured anyway. Diaries, letters, interrogation transcripts that revealed the cognitive dissonance tearing through Japanese prisoners. A report from the 6th Army Interrogation Center on Luzon, March 1945, quoted a captured major. "The American nurses are a weapon we cannot counter. Every man who survives American captivity becomes proof that the propaganda was false, becomes a crack in the foundation of everything we were told. How do you fight an enemy who heals you? How do you maintain fighting spirit when prisoners return from American hospitals healthier than when they were captured?" Another prisoner, a private named Takeshi Sato, who'd been wounded on Okinawa, told interrogators, "In our army, if you were wounded badly, your officer might give you a grenade to kill yourself. He would call it mercy. The Americans gave me blood transfusion, antibiotics I had never heard of, surgery that saved my arm. Who is really merciful?" The industrial scale of American medical care was perhaps the most devastating weapon of all, not in the immediate tactical sense, but in the strategic arithmetic of morale and replacement capacity. By 1945, the United States was training 3,000 new nurses per month, cycling them through accelerated programs that compressed 4 years of civilian nursing education into 18 months of intensive military preparation. The production of medical supplies had reached levels that made the Japanese medical system look medieval. Penicillin production alone exceeded 1,500 pounds per month by war's end, enough to treat every American casualty and still have surplus for prisoners and liberated civilians. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The plasma program represented industrial medicine at scales the Axis powers couldn't comprehend. The American Red Cross collected 13 million pints of blood during the war, processing it into dried plasma that could be stored indefinitely and reconstituted in minutes on any battlefield. A single field hospital on Okinawa used more plasma in 1 month, treating both American and Japanese wounded, than the entire Imperial Japanese Army Medical Service had available for the entire China campaign. The numbers became their own form of psychological warfare. Every prisoner who survived knew he'd received care that his own army couldn't have provided, knew that the Americans had enough medical capacity to waste it, from the Japanese perspective, on enemies who would never fight for them again. The final boss encounter wasn't a weapon system or tactical innovation, but a conceptual barrier that American medical doctrine shattered without even trying. The Japanese military's complete inability to handle mass psychiatric casualties. By late 1944, as the island campaigns ground through Poliliu and Leyte and Iwo Jima, American nurses found themselves treating not just physical wounds, but psychological ones: shell shock, combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many days in caves waiting for flamethrowers. The Japanese military had no framework for this, no treatment protocols, no vocabulary beyond cowardice and lack of fighting spirit. American military psychiatry was crude by modern standards, but light years ahead of anything in the Pacific Theater. Dedicated psychiatric wards, trained therapists, rest and rehabilitation protocols that acknowledged combat fatigue as a medical condition rather than moral failure. A captured Japanese officer named Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, being treated for both shrapnel wounds and what the Americans called severe anxiety neurosis at a hospital on Guam, watched American psychiatric nurses work with combat fatigue Marines and experienced a revelation that he later described in his memoir. I saw American soldiers who could not stop shaking, who wept without reason, who screamed in their sleep. In our army, such men would be shot or forced back to the front. The Americans gave them medicine, talked to them for hours, sent them to quiet wards where they could recover. I realized then that the Americans valued their soldiers' minds as much as their bodies, that they understood something fundamental about human beings that we had forgotten in our worship of the warrior spirit. It was the moment I knew we had already lost, not because of their bombs or their ships, but because they treated their men as worth saving. The nurses working psychiatric wards in the Pacific faced challenges that had no clear solutions, only improvised approaches tested in real time. They learned to recognize the signs of suicidal ideation in Japanese prisoners, the sudden calmness after days of agitation, the refusal of food that went beyond cultural discomfort, the way some men would stare at the tent poles as if calculating distances and knots. They developed protocols, constant observation for high-risk cases, careful removal of anything that could be used as a weapon or a noose, conversations through interpreters that tried to explain that survival wasn't dishonor, that returning home after the war was possible, that life continued beyond capture. It didn't always work. Some prisoners found ways to die anyway, driven by shame too deep for American pragmatism to reach. But more survived than would have in any previous war, saved by a medical system that refused to accept that some wounds were untreatable simply because they couldn't be seen on an X-ray. The operation that crystallized everything came in August 1945, in the strange suspended moment between the atomic bombs and the formal surrender, when thousands of Japanese soldiers across the Pacific realized the war was ending and faced the question of whether to die or surrender. On Okinawa, a group of 47 Japanese holdouts emerged from the caves near Yanabaro, starving and sick and terrified, expecting execution and receiving instead transportation to the field hospital at Kadena. The nurses who received them, a team led by Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Hayes, a veteran of every major campaign since Guadalcanal, treated them with the same efficient care they'd shown thousands of others: triage, delousing, medical examination, treatment for malnutrition and parasites and wounds that had festered in the caves for months. One of the holdouts, a sergeant named Isamu Fujita, later wrote about the experience. "We walked into that American hospital ready to die. We walked out 3 weeks later, healthy, clothed, fed, unable to reconcile what we'd experienced with everything we'd been taught. The nurse who treated my infected foot, Lieutenant Hayes, I learned her name later. She worked on it for 40 minutes, cleaning the wound, applying medicine, wrapping it in clean bandages. When she finished, she looked at me and said through the interpreter, "There, you can walk properly now." As if that mattered. As if I was a person whose comfort was worth 40 minutes of her time. I had tried to kill her countrymen for 3 years, and she cared whether my foot hurt when I walked. The scoreboard wasn't written in kills, but in saves, and the numbers were staggering in their own way. American military nurses treated over 200,000 Japanese prisoners during the Pacific War, achieving a survival rate of 97% for those who reached medical facilities alive, higher than the survival rate for Japanese soldiers in their own military hospitals, higher than the rate for Chinese prisoners in Japanese camps, higher than anyone in Tokyo had thought possible. The field hospitals on Okinawa alone processed 15,000 Japanese wounded between April and August 1945, performing 3,000 surgeries, administering over 50,000 plasma transfusions, and maintaining infection rates below 5% in a tropical environment where disease should have killed more men than combat. The sortie numbers told a different story than aerial combat tallies or ship sinkings. Every day, across every island, nurses logged thousands of medical interventions, wound dressings changed, medications administered, vitals checked, complications managed, each one a small proof that the propaganda had lied, that the enemy was something other than demons. The statistics accumulated into an undeniable pattern. The average Japanese prisoner gained 15 pounds during the first month of American captivity, recovered from chronic malnutrition that had been endemic in the Imperial Army's logistics system, received dental care many had never experienced even in civilian life, and got treatment for diseases, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, that Japanese military medicine had largely given up trying to cure in forward areas. At the POW camp on Guam, American nurses ran a clinic that saw over 100 prisoners daily, treating everything from minor infections to major surgical follow-ups, maintaining medical records that detailed each man's care with a precision that seemed almost obsessive to prisoners accustomed to military systems where individual soldiers were expendable units. A Japanese doctor named Captain Takashi Morimoto, captured on Saipan and later employed as a medical assistant in the Guam Camp Hospital, observed, "The American nurses keep records of everything. Every pill, every bandage, every temperature reading, all written down. At first I thought it was bureaucracy, American love of paperwork. Then I realized it was respect. They documented our care because they believed we deserved the same accountability they gave their own wounded. It was humbling." The munitions of this particular war were measured in different units. 800 million gauze bandages produced during the war years, 6 million plasma units processed and shipped, 4 billion aspirin tablets manufactured, 200 million morphine syrettes filled and distributed, enough sulfanilamide powder to treat every infected wound in every theater, enough penicillin to revolutionize combat medicine forever. But perhaps the most devastating ammunition was simpler. The 70,000 American women who deployed as military nurses, each one a walking refutation of the propaganda, each one trained to standards that made the Axis medical services look primitive, each one capable of saving lives with a competence that transcended ideology. They were the weapon that won no battles, but changed the war's meaning, the force that couldn't be countered because it attacked the foundation of enemy morale rather than enemy positions. The ratio that mattered wasn't kill to death, but something harder to quantify. The number of Japanese prisoners who went home after the war carrying memories of American nurses who treated them with professional care, who'd seen past the uniform to the wounds beneath, who'd demonstrated through action that enemies could be healed rather than destroyed. A post-war study by the U.S. Army's Historical Division interviewed over 3,000 Japanese prisoners about their experiences in American captivity, and 78% cited medical care as the factor that most changed their view of Americans. The comments were variations on a theme. They treated us like humans. The nurses saved my life when my own army would have let me die. I learned that propaganda lies, but medicine doesn't. One former Imperial Navy pilot, shot down over the Philippines and treated for burns at a hospital in Manila, wrote, "The American nurse who changed my bandages every day never asked my name, never asked how many Americans I'd killed. She asked only if the pain was manageable, if I needed more morphine, if I could eat the food they brought. In her eyes, I was just another burned man who needed help. It was the most radical thing anyone had ever done to me. The vulnerability window that American nurses exploited wasn't tactical, but human. The moment when a wounded man, enemy or not, realized he was going to receive care rather than execution, treatment rather than torture, that the propaganda had lied about the most fundamental thing. It was a window measured in seconds, the moment of first contact, when fear and expectation collided with reality. But its effects lasted years. Japanese prisoners who'd been treated by American nurses became problems for the militarist ideology that had sustained the war. They were living evidence that the enemy wasn't subhuman, that surrender didn't mean death, that the code of Bushido and the reality of modern war existed in different universes. Some prisoners became so convinced of American goodwill that they volunteered to help with translations, to assist in convincing other holdouts to surrender, to work in the camps not from coercion, but from genuine belief that the war's continuation was pointless slaughter. The Japanese High Command had no counter to this. No way to suppress the knowledge that spread through whispers and letters and eventually radio broadcasts as the war ground toward its end. The operation that sealed the narrative happened not in combat but in the occupation, when American medical teams moved into Japan itself in September 1945 and began treating the Japanese civilian population with the same protocols they'd used for prisoners. In Tokyo, in Osaka, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and every devastated city, American nurses set up clinics and treated radiation victims, starvation cases, tuberculosis patients who'd gone years without medication, children with infections that would have killed them without antibiotics. The Japanese people, prepared by propaganda for rape and pillage and atrocity, instead received medical care that exceeded what their own government had provided during the war years. A Japanese schoolteacher named Sachiko Tanaka, treated for radiation sickness by a U.S. Army nurse in Hiroshima, wrote in her diary, "Today an American woman, an enemy woman, gave me medicine that stopped my bleeding, that made it possible to keep food down, that let me sleep without pain for the first time in weeks. She told me through the interpreter that I would get better, that the treatment would continue, that I should come back in 3 days. I asked her why Americans were helping us after what we had done. She said, 'Because you're sick and we're nurses.' That's enough reason. I do not know how to process this. Everything I was told about the American devils was wrong." The respect turned from grudging to explicit in the post-war years, encoded in memoirs and oral histories and official documents that revealed how deeply the American medical approach had shaken Japanese military assumptions. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, executed for war crimes in 1946, told his American guards before his death, "Your nurses were soldiers we could never defeat. They took our wounded and made them doubt the war. They showed kindness that our propaganda said was impossible. If Japan had had such a medical system, perhaps more of our men would have survived to rebuild what we destroyed." A captured Japanese admiral, interrogated about kamikaze pilot motivation, observed, "We told the pilots they were gods, that death was glory, that the Americans would desecrate their bodies if captured. Then pilots who ditched and survived came back from American hospital ships, telling stories of nurses who treated them like patients instead of enemies. The cognitive dissonance destroyed morale faster than any battle loss. How do you convince a man to die for the emperor when other men returned from the enemy's hands alive and healthy?" The industrial avalanche in medical terms was perhaps America's most complete victory. A logistics and training system that could produce nurses faster than casualties could overwhelm them, that could ship medical supplies across oceans at scales that made scarcity impossible, that could maintain field hospitals in jungles and on beaches and in bombed-out buildings with the same standards that civilian hospitals back home struggled to meet. By war's end, the United States had trained over 150,000 nurses for military service, with 2/3 deployed overseas at peak mobilization. The training pipeline could produce a fully qualified combat nurse in 18 months, compared to the 4 years required in peacetime and the virtually non-existent training pipeline for female medical personnel in Japan. The production comparison was devastating. America graduated more nurses in 1944 alone than Japan had trained in the entire war, produced more penicillin in a month than the Imperial Army received in a year, manufactured more plasma in a week than the Japanese medical service had available in total. The replacement rate told the strategic story. An American nurse wounded or killed in a bombing raid, and over 200 died during the war, could be replaced within weeks by another trained professional from the pipeline. A Japanese medical orderly killed in combat might never be replaced at all, leaving units to manage casualties with fewer and fewer trained personnel. American field hospitals maintained staffing levels that allowed for rest rotations, leave time, mental health breaks for nurses dealing with trauma. Japanese medical personnel worked until they collapsed, then kept working, sustained by ideology that provided no recognition that caregivers themselves needed care. The morale differential became mathematical. American nurses could maintain professional standards because the system supported them with supplies, replacements, and doctrine that acknowledged human limits. Japanese medical staff operated in conditions of permanent crisis, making triage decisions that often came down to who would die fastest without treatment. The final accounting wasn't measured in blood types matched or plasma units transfused, but in something harder to quantify and impossible to forget: the 78,000 Japanese prisoners who survived American captivity and went home after the war, carrying the knowledge that everything they'd been told about the enemy was wrong. They became teachers, businessmen, farmers, fathers who told their children stories about American nurses who'd saved their lives when their own army had left them for dead. They became the foundation of post-war reconciliation, living proof that enemies could become something other than enemies if someone was willing to treat the wounds instead of adding to them. The cultural shift they represented was seismic, from a militarist ideology that valued death over surrender to a post-war democracy that valued life over ideology. And the bridge between those worldviews was built in part by American women who'd simply done their jobs with competence and compassion in field hospitals across the Pacific. Today, in the National Museum of the Pacific War, in Fredericksburg, Texas, there's a glass case containing artifacts from a field hospital on Okinawa. A nurse's uniform, yellowed with age and still stained with old blood. A surgical kit with instruments worn smooth from use. A logbook recording treatments administered in April 1945 with handwriting that remains crisp and professional across the decades. Next to the case is a letter, written in careful English and donated by the family of a Japanese veteran named Toshiro Yamada. I was wounded on Okinawa and treated by an American nurse whose name I never learned. She saved my leg when infection should have killed me. She changed my bandages with hands that never hesitated, that never showed disgust or hatred, that simply did what needed to be done. I went home after the war and lived 50 more years because of her. I raised 3 children and saw 7 grandchildren born. I taught school for 30 years and tried to show my students the same kindness she showed me. I never forgot her face, never forgot that in the worst moment of my life, when I expected death, an American woman gave me life instead. If there is a heaven, I hope she knows what she did mattered. The final line of the museum placard reads, "The nurses of the Pacific War fought with different weapons than the men beside them, but they won the same war, and something more, they won the peace that followed." If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.